Hi everyone, my name is Vandita Morarka and I'm from One Future Collective. I use the pronouns she and they. I'm very excited today to host a panel that's going to examine and think a lot about what wellness really means for civil society organizations. And I'm so thrilled that today we have with us three people who are brilliant activist leaders and also champions of well-being within CSOs. And personally, they're all three people from whom I have learned so much. I've really questioned my personal beliefs on well-being and really pushed how we can come together to advocate and change what wellness can mean in this space. Very excited to have them. We have Leila, Omaid, and Parth. I'm going to quickly introduce them, but any introduction I do is definitely not going to do them justice. And you can read more about them in the description that's linked below. I'll start with Omaid. Omaid is the co-founder and president of ArtLords and has steered a global grassroots movement that empowers artists and activists to use art as a catalyst for social change and empowerment. Omaid, do you want to say hello?
Hello, Vandita. Thank you so much, and everybody. Just very pleased to be here, and thank you for joining us and watching this video.
Thanks, Omaid. Over to Leila. Leila is a senior international development professional and the co-founder of We Are Feminist Leaders. They have over 15 years of experience working at the intersection of youth rights and gender. Leila.
Hi everyone. Really happy to be here. Such a privilege to be asked to be in conversation with all of you. Yeah.
Thank you. And we have Parth. Parth Sharma is a decolonial researcher, liberation therapist, and a culture worker who specializes in providing psychotherapy to survivors of systemic violence. Parth is also the founder of T&F India, a volunteer-driven lived experience youth coalition, and a core member of Bystanders No More, a multinational human rights volunteer initiative. Parth, over to you.
Thanks, Vandita. I'm very excited to be here. Hi, everyone. I'm very glad to share this panel with you all.
Thank you, Parth. So for everyone watching, what we're going to do is we're going to have some open questions for everybody on the panel, and then we're going to direct some specific questions to panelists. In the end, we also shared on social media that we'll be hosting and recording this panel. So we have some questions from community members, which is the One Future Collective community. So those will be some random, I think like buzzer feed round questions in the end, and we'll get to that as we have time. I'm going to start with a question and anybody can take it up. I think something I've been really curious about, even especially after the pandemic in India, is what is the specific impact of the nature of the work that all of us do on our well-being? And is there a tendency amongst the sector? Like I remember when I joined the sector, I said, oh, this is what we do outside. So we must really care about well-being inside. And that didn't happen. So if we exist to advance social well-being, then why do we end up not prioritizing that for our own workers? Very simple question. Anybody who wants to start with it, please do.
Shall I start? Are we happy? Yeah, so thank you, Vandita, for mentioning the really difficult context I think we're all swimming in at the moment, because I think actually CSOs are operating on unprecedentedly challenging terrain. And you mentioned the pandemic, but look, there's multiple overlapping crises, right? We had the pandemic, rising authoritarianism in many parts of the world. We're seeing the climate emergency, political violence, a live stream genocide going on, unprecedented economic inequalities, kind of precarity, cost of living crises. And like the rest of society, CSOs exist within this general climate of all of these different shifting plates, but also a general climate of kind of anxiety, anger, despair. And then you layer on top of that the nature of the work that we do, which for many of us, depending on the work that we're doing, many of us in the social justice space, this is exposing us either to kind of direct trauma or secondary. Some of you may understand it as vicarious trauma. And of course, this is having a huge impact. There's like a quote that says, you can't expect to swim in water and not get wet, right? And so for me, I'm someone who I strive to be a feminist leader. The issue of wellness in CSOs, we have a duty of care to our staff. And I think the dissonance is that point you made around, when I entered the sector too, Vandita, I had expectations that internal practices of wellness would be somewhat of a priority, and was really surprised. I mean, I entered in the humanitarian space. I was surprised to see the expectations for overtime, the levels of burnout. And I think many CSOs have adopted really quite neoliberal working practices. So, this focus on efficiency, effectiveness, toxic productivity. We strive for growth, results at all costs, and just generally no time to pause or reflect at all. And I think the impact of that, the point I want to make before I hand over, is the impact of that. Let's not forget, it's felt intersectionally. So the impacts of this stress, or the potential for stress or burnout or anxiety, these aren't evenly distributed among volunteers or staff in the NGO sector. Depending on the context in which the work is being done, the impacts of all this are felt intersectionally, and that is something I feel that is often missed. And I'm sure we'll come back to this point later. But the result of all this is that there's high expectations on people to be resilient, and those expectations are very rarely evenly distributed. So maybe I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you very much. I think especially the mention of the poly crisis at the beginning, and then just the dissonance and the increasing vicarious trauma that people feel in the sector with perhaps no recourse often. It's just been a really difficult space for a lot of us to have been in. Omaid, I might tap into you if you want to come in. I also know there was a recent conference that I think you were a part of, which really used art to perhaps talk about some of this as well. So please go ahead.
So thank you, Vandita and Leila, very well eloquently mentioned all of this. Look, before speaking about this, I just want to set the stage, because when we're talking about mental health, well-being, healing, these are very personal. And I think for our audience and for the people who will be listening to this, I think it's very important that they know who we are and from which background we're coming and speaking. I grew up all my life in Afghanistan. And when you speak about Afghanistan, 3 decades of trauma, emotional trauma, war, violence, losing members of my family, and all kind of loss, both physical and mental challenges that I've been facing. But now I don't live in Afghanistan. I'm forced to leave Afghanistan, which is another trauma, because I was exiled. I was forced when the Taliban took over. So I live like a refugee between different cities, Boston, Washington, D.C., and Istanbul. So I'm trying to find a new home for myself. So this is sort of the background when I'm speaking about all of this. All of this emotional trauma, anxiety, PTSD, all of panic attacks, all of them are so personal to me. So like many of us in the civil society and many of us who are leading organizations, I think these are very personal. We experience it ourselves every single day. And we're trying to find ways to deal with it. So I'm coming from that kind of a background. I think for us, all of us, we are working in a very high stress environment. We know all of that. Especially now in the global majority, in the parts of the world that some of us are working in India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, the global majority. And you feel a lot of emotional trauma, you feel violence, you feel war. So there is a lot of stress on your mind, on your physical health, on your mental health, and there's little help available. The second point I want to make is about we always focus on the mission, on the social good, on the work, and the self-care. It just happens. We know it that this is not okay, but we do it. We've been doing it for the last 20 years that I've been in the sector. So focus on the mission, focus on the social good, focus on the themes and all of that. But our mental health being, our physical health being is always neglected. And also, I think when I think about what we do at ArtLords for all of this, despite being that we are well aware of this, we have sort of mental health days, we have art therapy, body mapping, everything that we can do. But still, I think it has not been enough because the sustainability of the organization, the burnout that Leila was mentioning, is all impacted. So for us at this junction that we are right now, what has really helped, what has really come to our attention is that if we're not okay, if you're mentally not okay, if you're not healing, we cannot find solutions. We cannot find solutions for all those social good, for all of those things that we're trying to help. The world is in a crisis, we all know. And as civil society leaders, we are trying to help in a way to find solutions for climate justice or for the wars or the conflicts and all of that. And I think if we are not okay, we will not be able to provide those solutions. And at the same time, personally, to me, I'm raising a beautiful daughter, 2 years old right now. Even I'm going another level of personal, we will not be able to raise and nurture good children because you're borrowing the earth from our children right now. And if you're not nurturing these incredible people to take care of this earth, people and all of the things that there is, I don't think so we are doing a good job. So that I will leave it there. And I hope we'll come back to more practical and the solution that we all have to do to help this.
Thank you, Omaid. I think the nature, especially of the intergenerational trauma that passes on, even amongst people who are activists or people who work in this space. And if I may just extrapolate from what you shared, like some of us don't have choices to be in this sector, right? Like we are not choosing because I remember talking to one of my mentors and saying, okay, but what if I don't want to do this? And she said, do you really have a choice? Because the community is still your community and the people are still your people. And if they call you, are you going to say no? So I think that's where the intergenerational aspect, also what you shared about, raising children in a way that perhaps does not further this harm was really powerful. Thank you. Parth, I know your context as a culture worker and a psychotherapist. Of course, you can add anything else as well. But I think from that lens right now would be really useful.
Thanks, and I think it's very interesting that, I joined the sector very recently. I'm 25 years old, so that sets the context of my nature of my experience. But within this time, I think the bubble started bursting as to the way that we view the owners of care, right? That there is a structural omission of the non-for-profit industrial complex in our own sector to begin with. That we're not recognizing that structurally we have created spaces and jobs and precarity within these positions itself. So then who is the onus of care at? And as a psychotherapist, I think when I was working with people and I've been working at OPDs, and there's a lot of activism burnout that happens in the groups that I run, specifically right now with the Palestinian Liberation Movement as well, that you see people burning out because they don't have funds to give for mutual aid. People don't have time to give out for activism, right? Because they're working so hard within the non-for-profit sector as well. And as someone, I think I'm a person with visual and psychosocial disabilities. So when I joined the non-for-profit sector, the ableism within the sector itself on how we deem functionality was really surprising to me. So when you joining the sector, and when I joined the sector and I looked at care, I looked at, okay, am I even included within the existing care formats? And that inclusivity was not there. Then you add on the layer that I'm a queer trans person or queer non-binary person, then that adds on another layer of, okay, there's now more structural exclusion which is happening. So when you're working with your own communities in that sense, and you're constantly in that environment where, okay, I'm working with disenfranchised communities, they're my people, so it's not a choice per se that I have, but I'm at the same time, I'm disenfranchised within the system itself. So we don't talk about the non-for-profit industrial complex enough to even acknowledge the fact that our industry is built on the funding network. It's built on precarity. It is built on exploiting young people and their efforts in the longer term as well, right? So I think the more that we start acknowledging those things, sustainable outputs come from that acknowledgement to begin with. So I think that is something that I hope we also come back to within this conversation, but that is what I would like to start with.
No, thank you, Parth. And since you took us in that direction, maybe I will reverse the order of my questions. I'm going to bring up something that might even be a little controversial. At least in the Indian context, sometimes I feel like CSO workers have lost their identity as a worker. Because we see this as something we do because we care, because it's our community, for whatever reason, it's really difficult to get people in the civil society space to see that they are also a worker, worthy of rights, worthy of benefits, worthy of protections, right? A living wage, things like that. And when that gets internalized, that becomes quite systemic, right? Like the funder is also from this community. So the funder is also saying, oh no, they're happy to do it for less money. They care about it, so they will do it anyway. Or they know that the person cares enough to never leave. You give them money, you don't give them money, they're never really going to leave. And an added layer to this is does this system really want to solve the problem, right? Or does it benefit? Because, going back to something Omaid and I think Leila also hinted at is, if people are not well, they are not going to be able to come together to create and think of radical solutions, right? So I have one paraphrase question, but feel free to take it in the direction you all want to. Something I've been thinking about a lot is, in your context, do you have labor laws and social protections that CSOs are able to offer, which could either further the well-being of their workers or take away from it, right? So I know I'm talking about labor laws and protections, but perhaps you can also come in on what the funding ecosystem is like. Does it really support long-term sustainability? Does it allow for well-being? I have some follow-ups, but I will ask that later. I'm going to ask again who wants to go first. Yes, Omaid, please go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, Vandita. I will speak about this on a couple of contexts. So we have offices in Afghanistan. We have an office in the United States, and we have a small office here in Istanbul. So I'm speaking about this from all of these three different places that we work. Inside Afghanistan, where the majority of our work is happening, and we have many staff and artists and activists, especially artists. So we are working in a context of dealing with the Taliban and the Taliban regime and all of that. So they legally does not recognize any civil society organizations. So you, as an artist, as an activist, most of our work is completely banned. It's illegal. They just also enacted a new law, which is like you cannot show any moving, like you cannot publish any moving people. So it's so basically our work is completely under the even we're not even talking about the rights of artists or activists or social workers or any of that. So in the context of Afghanistan, everything is gone. That's a very sort of exceptional, but also so horrible that I sometimes just feel that what you can do about it. Like I'm just like every day I get a bad news about a new law the Taliban are impacting. In the context of the US and in Istanbul, mainly in the US, I think what we really feel is that the competition for resources among the civil society organizations in the US, especially the art and culture organizations, because the resources are so limited, I think that has created sort of an environment, a very toxic environment, I would say, that the donors does not care much about like what they can do or like how much resources they can give it to you to continue your work or the well-being of your staff or sustainability of your organization and all of that. So everybody is somehow struggling and trying to keep their heads above the water, get whatever resources available, and try to position themselves in a way that they can do the job, they can deliver, just to stay afloat, just to stay alive. And it's a horrible situation because we are doing it because the mission is so important. We're doing it because the work is so important. For example, for us, ArtLords is one of the only art organizations surviving from Afghanistan in the transition. So for me, it's so important that we keep this work because this is the resistance against the Taliban. But at the same time, when you're in the US and in our office and we're fundraising, and then the donor community is like, they'll give you scraps for the work you do. And that scraps barely makes your organization to stay alive, not even thinking about sustainability, emotional well-being, health, and all of that. So I think it's the time I was in New York for the UNGA and I was in South Africa for the Global Artivism Conference. And I think I saw a tendency among the donor community as well, and also a bit of a solidarity among the civil society organizations that we can push back a little bit. We can talk. We talked with 40 foundations in New York a couple of weeks ago. And these are private foundations, big organizations. I think they're willing to listen to us at this moment because I think resources is one of the most important factors in this. We have a lot of creativity. We can come up with so many ways to address these issues, but resources is very important because they can keep our organizations going. So I think that is the time that we have this conversation, build the unity, build the solidarity, have the conversations within ourselves in the civil society, and then push back against the donor community, which is now, I think, is opening to listen and be more flexible with their funding and resources.
Thank you very much for that, Omaid. I'm very curious to understand, perhaps, we come back to it, is what enables this solidarity between civil society organizations, and how can we replicate more of that to sort of shift and create power? Leila, maybe I'll tap you in, because earlier you were talking about the intersectional impact of some of this as well. And I think this could be a really good moment for that.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing up labour rights in this discussion about wellness, because I mean it's so obvious, isn't it? It's just the foundation for everything. It's not about yoga lessons at lunchtime and I don't know, a meeting-free Friday, which doesn't work anyway. So let's start with labour rights. So look, what I've seen, and maybe I can say, look, I work with a vast range of civil society actors, a lot of work with big international organizations, but also very small feminist organizations supporting survivors of sexual violence. And one thing that really bothers me is the way access to wellness and some of these rights are just so unevenly distributed. So a story, for you, I did a piece of research with a colleague with a small organization that supports women who have been subjected to sexual violence. And it was all about kind of the levels of well-being in the organization. And because of the funding ecosystem being the way it is, because of funding being so short-term, so scarce, as Omaid said, high levels of competition, these salaries are very low for these highly skilled workers, providing trauma-informed care to these women. And there were cases of staff who had taken on second jobs working in pubs in the evening. There were cases of staff who were selling some of their belongings in order to make ends meet. There were cases of, 50-year-old women saying, I can't afford to live on my own anymore. I'm going to have to go and get a flat share because I can't pay the rent. And at the same time, I'm attending international NGO meetings, and I'm sat next to someone who is searching for houses in the UK during this meeting. She's on a house search website. She's buying a new house, and she's looking at houses in the range of £900,000. And these are both people working on violence against women, just in vastly different parts of the sector. Okay, so the point I want to make is around the way these rights are just so unequally distributed, and the inequality that exists within the sector that I think we need to pay attention to. And then just to give people some hope around funders, so Omaid mentioned, that there's a glimmer of hope. There are funders trying to do this work really well. And I think the funders that are trying to do this work well and resource care for activists are often the feminists, some of the feminist funders. So I want to give Urgent Action Fund their flowers. I want to give the African Women's Development Fund their flowers. And I think the difference is these are funders who really understand that the notion of care is political. This isn't a nice to have. This isn't about optimizing productivity. This isn't about a means to an end. They understand that the very notion of care in and of itself is inherently political, and that wellness is an issue around power, and that we need to be asking ourselves, well, who is able to make choices to be well within the sector and who isn't? Who has access to what they need to be able to nurture their own well-being, and who's being denied it? And they see this as a political issue, a social justice issue, and they're moving the funding accordingly to support wellness, to support activists to be able to pause, to heal. Going back to Omaid's doing amazing work around healing, the importance of healing, and they're investing money in that. And I think we can learn a lot from those funders, and we need more of them.
Well, thank you so much, Leila. If I may share, I'll share a quick personal experience as well. So I think I went for the first international trip of my life, which was a work trip when I was 23. And so the organization that called us, I went on a full scholarship. I couldn't have afforded it otherwise. But, they give you a stipend for very particular things. And I remember having to save every bit of the stipend because everyone else would like hang out on the weekend, and being able to afford a drink in Canada, given I, used to earn in Indian rupees, it was impossible. And we were human rights defenders from across the world. And then there were others who, and this is my reality, and then there were others who were like parents of 2 kids, and they were saving the money because the currency conversion is so high that they would rather go without a meal on a day because they can send that money back home. And like you said, there were people who were, okay to get like 6 drinks at a bar, where one was unaffordable for some of us. And the disparity in that space is the first time I realized how difficult it is. And I think much more difficult for some than even for me, because my choice was still like, okay, can I go without a drink, right? Or can I go without a meal outside? Whereas for some, it was life-changing money to be able to save money that month and send it back home, because of how much impact that had. So yeah, and it's quite common for people from like global, what you call global south or global majority countries, to constantly be saving even when we're outside. Yeah, so thank you for that. I really, really resonate. And also the aspects around safety, and when you work with survivors, the sort of resource disparity that can exist. Something that we've really thought about is, does our salary and compensation allow a survivor to leave an abusive home? Are there certain like wellness, labor? For me, all of this is the same. But do we have principles like that are used to benchmark our policies and our compensation systems? Or do they assume a certain level of financial well-being already before you join this space, right? No, thank you very much for that. I think both of those really resonated with me. Parth, over to you.
Thanks. And I think this is, I completely resonate with all of your experiences. I think that's something that I'm dealing with on a day-to-day basis as well. That, I have a non-registered organization in India, which is run with, we have over 50 volunteers who are all young people who are queer, trans people from the margins, right? One of the reasons that we wanted to keep it unregistered was because the moment you register an organization in India, funding and international funding is dependent on an FCRA license. Now, there are terms and conditions in a very thin line and a very small font which are attached here to the FCRA license on things that you can apply for funding for and things which are off limits completely. So anything which is overtly political is off limits completely. So when we're talking about the funding ecosystem within India and the rising authoritarianism here, it becomes very interesting to look at what is funded. I'm a mental health professional by lived experience, by learned experience, by labored experience. This is my day-to-day bread and butter. Yet mental health research, which is biomedical, is funded by international organizations. Yet mental health research, which is political, which is community-oriented, still does not have funding spaces. So when we're looking at that ecosystem as well, right, even from a personal example, when I'm working with different organizations, neutrality as a thought is not a choice, it's but by force there. Because you have to sustain funding, you have to get funding from organizations which are going to be able to pay salaries for people, because the disenfranchisement is to a level where you can't go without salaries. Because people don't have the money or the safety enough to be able to be rooted within that work system, right? So neutrality by force is something that they adopt. Even with the current genocide going on, political views, etc., of the employees, regulations happen on that level. And I really like the point that was mentioned earlier as to who has access to wellness, right? I would also put up another question and say, what is wellness in that context as well? For me, when I look at wellness in general, it would be the systemic harm that comes in. And are there any safeguards within my organization, within my community, which prevent me from receiving that harm on a day-to-day basis? Or ableism within that space, transphobia within that space. So wellness as a definition itself is rooted in the individual in a very capitalistic, commercialized care model, which has also been co-opted by, okay, we can give you this product or this package, and we can give you one employee assistant program or a leave here. So we're still focused on curative models that, okay, there is a distress that we're anticipating because of the work that we're putting someone through. Therefore, we're going to give them 2 days off on a mental health leave. We're still not looking at preventive factors and systemic factors that influence health in the first place. So when the funding ecosystem does not even give time between two projects for a person, right, who is going through financial insecurity, housing insecurity, is going through food insecurity, how are we then focusing on wellness as an aspect? So that's something that I personally relate to as well. And I really like the level of discussion that we're actually naming the fact that it is political. Who gets care and who's providing care? And that's a very important factor in terms of power dynamics that we need to note here.
Thanks for that part. I think something that's really stood out for me from what you shared is also a lot of the cultural aspect of wellness, right? I think we have discussed that there's a certain funding, bureaucratic and resource component to well-being, which sort of lays the foundation for what is realistically possible. But what you hinted towards around culture and what like needs might be and what community needs might be, it reminds me of an example a friend shared. She said they're paying me as though I have a family of 4, but I am in a community setup. Like if you think of India, you are not responsible for a family of 4. If you're someone who earns a little bit more, you're responsible for absolutely any relative, any community member who might have a need at any point. So then what do like adjustments for money, what do adjustments for well-being look like, and what are people doing day to day to even adjust that, right? So I read this one organization, I'm forgetting their name, which asks people in the team to benchmark their salaries basis their lived experiences. So if they come from financial privilege, you can opt to take a lower salary, right? And if you don't come with that, then you can be at even a lower position hierarchically, but you can be paid a little bit more. So I think it helps balance out your lived reality with your financial like realities in the organization and actually moves to creating something more equitable. I do have a question for all of you. Given you're all founders of organizations at different stages, what has this tension, which I assume all of us are holding, right? What has that meant for you? And what do you think is also needed to support the well-being of founders? Because a narrative I've seen emerge recently has also been a lot of pushback against managers and founders. And what I struggle with is unless you start with generational money, what can they do? I mean, they can do to a certain extent, but what else can they do? And I'd be really curious to hear from you all. What have you done for yourself? What do you think needs to change? Anything there? Maybe this time, Parth, you want to go first and we can go reverse. Yeah.
Gotcha. I think I would start by just giving like an overview of the organization a little bit. So now I've grown up in volunteering spaces in community aid, and I've sort of lived through the fact that, I'm part of a queer community, I'm part of trans community, and that is how kinship works within Indian systems. And I also know that I come from a different caste privilege and I'm a light-skinned person. So there are still different power situations there and hierarchies there. Though that community has been something that I've always been rooted in. I've worked volunteering throughout my childhood, teen years, and also in my early adulthood throughout my college, right? Part of that volunteering work ends up becoming the onus of, okay, this is unpaid labor that you're putting in towards work that should be essentially is the onus of the state. So when I was also forming the organization, just the Trauma Action Foundation, I'm also looking at, what work we want to do. One of the most basic things was that we're putting a cap on not more than 5 to 10 hours of volunteering a month by all the volunteers, including myself as a founder, because this is something we don't have funding right now. We do grassroots, we're raising funds through grassroots initiatives. We're funding each other for the work that we're doing and try to compensate each other for the work that we're doing. So when there is no external funding, we thought, okay, what is the way that we can safeguard our own health, our own mental health, and provide some sort of a safeguarding policy to all the volunteers who are young. And this is their first experience of volunteering, right? We're not bringing them into an environment and saying, okay, we're already from communities which are strategically underserved, and now prove your worth by volunteering a little bit more. So I think having that 5-hour mark or 10-hour mark puts in that idea that we're not working towards an output-oriented approach where we need to constantly keep products out, we need to constantly pump research out. So the work that we're doing is sustainable, is long-term, and that's something that's been working really well lately. And at the same time, I think it's also very important to recognize that volunteering also comes from a position of space where people have that much time in their day-to-day lives where they can volunteer. So volunteering in itself is a very political act, that you have time where you're not responsible for the livelihood of your own community systems, etc. And then you have spare time to volunteer towards community settings as well, right? So recognizing that aspect and also making sure that we don't need to give an output or participate to receive support. So all our support care models and everything that we do is open to anyone who wants to join in any capacity. And that's something that I've also noticed works really well for me, because we're not only decentralizing the process of care by saying that, okay, we're all in the same boat, it's a flat hierarchy, but at the same time, I don't need you to provide or participate for me to provide you care, and it goes vice versa as well. So that's somewhere where I'm trying to safeguard my own work and my strength within my community setting as well. But unfortunately, that's not the truth with other organizations that I volunteer with, right? I related to the last point where I'm one of those people right now at my age where I am in a flat share system, and I work multiple jobs to be able to sustain my own space and also try and fund whatever little I can for my volunteers and the people who are working within my organization. So that onus of care does fall into, where do I stop working? I work in community-based participatory research. Where does that my lived experience stop and work start? So that distinguishing factor between a work-life balance is just not possible when you're working within community settings. So I think it becomes extremely important on where can we where can we set the mark for ourselves, and where can we stop and say that, okay, this is the limit of how much I can provide, and I'm okay with that limit at this point. If there is external funding, we would be very glad to start compensating people fairly more and even create those outputs which are required. But for now, this model works really well for us.
Thank you, Parth. That's really interesting. And if you share a resource with us on it, we can also link it when we share the video, I think, for anyone watching in. Omaid, do you want to go next?
Sure. Before coming to your question about the founders and what we face, I think I'll go back to you shared the experience about like civil society activists, they're not even having like saving meals and sending the money back home. I've lived on both sides of the fence. I just wanted to share that, and then I'll come back to the point about solidarity and building that unity that we were speaking about. So as an AV1 activist, when I was traveling to all these conferences, and I think there was always, the first thing they would check in a menu was the price, how much is the cost to get this. And then automatically in my mind, I will change it to the AV1 currency, and then I will say, oh my God, it's like 1,000 AV1s, and it's a lot of money back home. So that has been part of my life for a very long time. Not anymore, because now I work and live in Washington, D.C., and it's a complete different ball game, I would say. And I think when I compare these two, being in the US is very recent, 3 years, but I've lived all of my life back in Afghanistan and other places. So it brings me to the point that how we can build that cohesion, that unity, that solidarity within the civil society organizations and actors. And I think it really starts with sharing those resources, sharing the information about those resources. Because sometimes when I see in the US, for example, I think it's one of the biggest when it comes to donors, resources, funding, opportunities, and all of that. It's a big country, it's a big economy. So there's so many resources that I could share with organizations in South Asia, with Parth or Leila or whatever who needs it. And it does not take a lot of time. It's very competitive, yes, but there is a lot of resources and information that we can honestly share. And that brings me to the word empathy. You know, we coming from that kind of a background with a bit of empathy, I think we can do much to bring that cohesion and solidarity. And also we need to have those intentional practices and think like the intentions, the good intentions to do this. Because end of the day, I think we're all in this ship and we're all working and striving for social good, for people on the margins, for the artists, for the activists and all of that. And I think as these organizations are the beacon of hope in this world at this moment. And also transparency and accountability is very important. We have to be responsible. It's not like if you're getting the money, if you're getting the resources, if you're privileged sitting in Washington or Istanbul or places like that, we have to be transparent about it. So I think a bit of all of those will really build that cohesion and unity and solidarity within the civil society. And then I think we can go back and push back towards the donors and all of that. One small point as well, coming from Afghanistan and South Asia, extensively working in South Asia, I think speaking about mental health is also taboo. I'm sure all of you know this. It is very recent, especially for me or people in Afghanistan. Even now, like my artists, they go through hell. They get kidnapped, they get tortured by the Taliban, but still they don't speak about the trauma and all of that because, you know, they're very patriarchal, masculine, and all of that. It's taboo to speak in those cultures. So I think part of my job at ArtLords has also been how we can normalize this. Because I speak about it every time. I speak about my panic attacks. I speak about my depression, anxiety, and all of that. Just not to that process everything, but also help my staff, my artists, people who follow me and look at me, that it's okay to speak about it. It's okay to ask for help. So that was just for the points I had. On your question, look, Vandita, I think every time I go to these conferences, the first thing I tell them that we are on the front line of whatever is coming. If it's the stress, if it's the anxieties, if it's the panics, as founders, as presidents of the organizations, you feel responsible for the fundraising, for the sustainability of the organization, for the well-being of your staff, everything. And then the expectations, like everybody in that ecosystem expects you to do well, to have solutions, to provide. Just a small example of ArtLords when the Taliban took over in Afghanistan, and then we were getting evacuated from and I was in one of those planes that left Kabul a week later, over 100 artists with their families were expecting me to evacuate them from Afghanistan. And it took me 3 years, every single day and night. I've not taken a day off to fill the forms, work with different governments, work with different NGOs to evacuate people, to help people, to provide for all those artists at risk who are not only in Afghanistan, but other places as well. So I think that expectation does not let you to think about your well-being, but also puts a lot of pressure on the shoulders of the founders and the presidents. I think they need an exceptional treatment. I don't know how. I have not found it yet. I've not found it for myself. I have neglected my health, my physical health, my mental health, and all of that. But I'm preaching about this. I know it. I understand it. I'm trying to process it, trying to find a way. But I think more than the individuals who are working in the organizations, but the founders, the presidents are more in the front line of depressions, traumas, and anxieties.
Thank you very much for that, Omaid, and also for sharing your personal experiences. There's definitely a lot there that I want to come back to, but I'll go to Leila and then come back to you with a specific question.
Yeah, I'm absorbing what my fellow panelists are saying. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, both of you, actually. So as a founder, look, one thing I learned from a really amazing Ugandan feminist organization I worked with called Raising Voices, who are brilliant on care, just brilliant. As Omaid used the word intentional, they have been intentional about care and wellness since their very inception. They haven't tried to kind of retrofit it on to the existing paradigm in which they've set themselves up in. And one thing someone from Raising Voices said to me was, they said the best way to care for yourself is to surround yourself with people who care about you. And so we are feminist leaders. Look, we're a very small team. You know, you're dealing with much larger numbers of people, so maybe that makes it a lot easier. There's about 5 of us. We don't, I guess the drawback is we don't have the same infrastructure as some of the larger organizations. Our funding model is quite different, so we're not able to offer maybe some of the wellness benefits that larger organizations might have. But really, we've just centered this notion of collective care, you know, the idea that, look, if you need to step back, I will step forward, and vice versa. And also kind of centered this idea of, look, when it comes to care, yes, we need the kind of the foundations to be there. We need decent work, we need secure contracts, you know, we need flexibility, whatever else it might be, parental leave, all of that stuff. But small things can be very powerful when it comes to care, you know, like I kind of feel like small things done consistently over time can be incredibly transformative, you know. So we, with the people we work with, we offer a small self-care fund every quarter that people can just use to spend on whatever they want. It's for them. We are very brave in terms of allowing people enough spaciousness. And I think such a big act of care in this sector can sometimes be just simply about allowing things the time that they require, and being brave enough to know when to pause. And things we have done, we have delayed projects. We have decided not to run a particular course at times when we have been feeling overwhelmed. And we've been able to do that because of our kind of more flexible funding model. And giving spaciousness has also for us meant, you know, giving people time to grieve, you know, in this socio-political moment. I don't think there's anyone on our team who isn't hurting and grieving. There's this sense of collective grief. So we give people space to grieve. And one of the things that we've done over the past year, we've seen that collective grief relating to increased militarism, this genocide in Palestine, you know, the violence in Myanmar, Sudan, I could go on. But one of the things we've done is we've used our organizational resources to engage in collective activism together with our team. You know, so we have a series of learning events around Palestine. It's not part of our kind of core work or our strategy, but we see it, look, people are grieving. They need to kind of metabolize their grief. And one of the ways we can do this is by working together on some activist projects like that. So yeah, I'd kind of say the power of the collective is really, really transformative. And as Omaid said, that intentionality is really, really important.
Oh, Leila, thank you. Thank you very much for that. There's actually a community question that I might just bring in now because of how relevant it seems. It came from a bunch of people which said that, there is well-being in the sector, which is about your job. But what happens when you come into the sector with mental illness? What happens when you come into the sector not well? And then what happens? And I'm going to give a quick example because they also shared that, the for-profit sector might be more demanding, but when it comes to things like this, they sometimes just have more systems to provide you care. Again, this is a community question, so I'm just sharing what was shared ahead, which means that irrespective of their politics, they have systems. And even in large INGOs, which might have the resources, and I think a lot of us have talked about intentionality. So even with resources, how do you build infrastructure that allows someone who is mentally unwell, like those are the words that were used, right? In the question, who's mentally unwell, mentally not doing okay, and joins the sector to also thrive here. And perhaps, Omaid, going to go to you, and then let anyone who wants to come in come.
Yeah, very difficult question, but let me be very honest. A lot of people, especially from my part of the world, that works in this ecosystem, in this sector, they go through a lot of mental health issues. If they accept it, good. If they do not, I think they're in denial because of all the emotional traumas, all the violence, all the wars and everything. Even if you're not from that part of the world, what is happening in the world right now, I don't think so any of us are okay. If you're okay with whatever is happening, from climate to genocides to gender apartheid of the Taliban to all wars in Sudan, everywhere. Like look around us. So I think we're not okay, and especially when it comes to civil society organizations, art organizations in particular, because there's limited resources. And then the artists, they have a type, they just tend to have a bit of they're very creative, but at the same time they also are sometimes challenged, and they're in their own mindsets and bubbles. So a lot of the people that I deal with, they are going through a lot of mental health issues. And I think the understanding is that as people in this ecosystem, what we are all doing to provide the help, provide the resources, and also make sure that we have some practices in place that at least help them process this in the long run. We have compiled many lists of resources, from counselors to psychiatrists to even the small applications that you can practice and listen to when you're alone, to very practical workshops on body mapping, on art therapy, and on healing, and then giant mural paintings. So all of those, both in practical workshops and also those resources which are available online, and creating that safe space where people come in and just talk, be themselves, respected with dignity and all of that. I think all of that is available within our ecosystem. We have intentionally done that in Afghanistan, which was very, very difficult. And I think we were one of the first organizations who brought the art therapy, that safe space, that place that you can dance, the place that you can create music, art, and all of that, as the only tool for your mental health issues. And also in the US, we're doing a lot of visioning, healing, and body mapping sessions. I just was in Toronto last week. We did a visioning body mapping session with exiled artists and activists. I mean, in Istanbul now, we're doing it the same here. So I'm going back to DC. So these are the kind of work that we do to provide a bit of help in the ecosystem for the people who really are willing to speak about it and join these sessions.
Well, that's really lovely to hear. And I'm really glad that some of the conversation is also giving us realistic, practical stuff about what you can do, right? So I feel like there's that great balance that's coming out as well. Parth, I'll just direct this question to you as well. I think the beginning you talked about functionality, right? And what the sector expects of you. And what happens when you don't come into the sector with that level of functionality or with a different type of functionality, then what happens? Yeah.
I think this is such a potent question because I'm someone with a psychosocial disability. I have major depression, and I also am neurodivergent. I'm also visually impaired. Have also from the queer community. There's multiple marginalizations that are at play within my own structure. So I'm not coming into the workspace equating my own functionality as someone who's able-bodied who does not come from these marginalizations. And I think that one of the most basic things is the lack of understanding around disability in our sector to begin with, internally. That we're not looking at mental health as a psychosocial disability, that it is a disabling thing to begin with, right? A very practical example I can give you is one of the days when I'm working and during peak summers in India. Anyone who's aware of Indian weather, summers tend to go really, really bad. And as someone who's on multiple antidepressants in the summer, it's not a good combination. And then it's a really, really bad space for you to sit with antidepressants in an NGO setup where you're with multiple people and you're working a very where you're working long hours as well. So the expectation is that, okay, can I be provided reasonable accommodations? But that's after you've already joined. That's not in the hiring process. So there is no disability inclusive hiring process to begin with within our sector because that understanding does not exist. So when you enter the sector and you start facing that harm and the systemic violence of, okay, I have now entered a disabling environment, people don't understand the language, there is an expectation of me performing at the same level of everyone else, I'm not allowed breaks in between, or I need different spaces, so that you have to start, the onus is on you to now explain that to everyone else, right? So that's already adding more on you as someone who is coming in with a disability to now explain your disability to everyone and why you are disabled. So then retrospectively, some reasonable accommodations are made into place because they're now legally mandated to. But for the longest time, they weren't. So they were not provided. And even today, I'm part of organizations which in my mind have been, there longer than I'm born. So they've been there for 30, 35 years. So they now have the understanding of what disability means to be a disability inclusive workspace. What about community organizations that are at grassroots level, where the understanding of mental health does not even exist, let alone disability? Disability is still looked at as a lack-based, approach where someone does not have enough competency to hire them. So then structurally omitted from the hiring process to begin with. So if at all you survive and somehow make it into the organization, what are you surviving at the end of the day? Are you surviving the hiring process and the NGO sector? Or are you surviving your own disability? So what are you performing? And then as someone with lived experience and as leading a lived experience coalition, there's this aspect of resilience pornography that because I'm doing so well, you see my performance and you start celebrating my performance because as someone who is disabled, I'm doing so well within the sector. So that is applauded. And my resilience is applauded, not the fact that systems are in place which are causing that much harm to begin with. So I think structurally, if there is sensitization on what disabilities is, it would help quite a bit for organizations to understand, one, what are visible disabilities and what are invisible disabilities, and then tally the cultural understanding of mental health. Because I agree, mental health is not a conversation which happens on a day-to-day basis in South Asia, and I don't expect it to. I come from a very decolonial understanding of, okay, if it's not culturally relevant for us to label it as mental health, as an illness, we don't have to. We look at what are cultural models of care that look at and explain mental health. If those are present, let's bring them to the conversation by sensitizing people. And not just sensitizing the people who are hiding, but the people who are from the forefront, right? There's someone standing at the gate. There's someone who meets you as an HR. There's someone that serves you tea. There's someone who's in the office with you. So at all different levels of our sector, you're interacting with people who need a sensitization of disability to begin with. And that's something I think is where we can start by inclusion and also understand how mental health works within the sector.
No, thank you very much for that, Parth. In fact, recently I met, there's a group of workers in India called ASHA workers who are essentially community health-based workers. They're women and they tend to have a lot of precarious employment. And I was working with a group of them to just understand from a labor rights perspective, right? Like what can we do to support them because there have been protests, etc. And one or two of them were just casually talking to me and they didn't have the word for it. So they were speaking in Hindi and they were saying they feel very uneasy in their chest all the time. And if they're in a crowded place, they feel like this. Or if they're meeting a certain officer who is responsible for having, say, sexually harassed other workers, they have now started feeling nervous. All of this was said in Hindi in terms that vary from like me to Omaid to Parth to Leila, right? Like all of us don't even use the same Hindi language for it. And even when they go to doctors, and even if there's treatment, or even if like they bring in an organization, maybe like mine from an urban area, a lot of grassroots workers also are not given the agency to understand and know what's happening with them. So I think even from a CSO worker point of view, there's such a disparity between who has not only access, but who has access to defining care for themselves and defining, not even defining, like knowing what's happening with them. Because all of this is happening to them in the course of their employment, but nobody's sitting down and taking the time to explain to them that this has happened. Even a counselor appointed by the organization is probably just telling them do this, or a psychiatrist is saying take these medicines. And there's just like a really broken system at play here. So really, thank you for that part. Leila, do you want to come in?
You're just making me think of another story with this. I'm thinking about this idea of like the coloniality of care within the NGO sector. And I'm thinking of, when I was quite junior in my career, I remember working on a research project where the research topic, so this was in northern Uganda, and the topic being research was heavy. It was quite traumatic. And there was an international team, and there was a local team, a Ugandan team of researchers kind of collaborating on this. And because of the nature of the research was quite, graphic, researchers were offered a space to debrief afterwards in the office. And it's making me think about how that debriefing space, it worked very well for the international researchers, but actually when we unpicked it to the Ugandan researchers, they felt that it was unprofessional. That was the word they used to kind of have that conversation in the office context. And not only that, after the debriefs had been running for like 2 weeks, and they did the international researcher, the lead researcher, the person who designed the research kind of consulted with the Ugandan researchers. The Ugandan researchers actually said, look, your debriefs are causing us more stress because actually we live here. You're making us stay in the office to do them. I've got kids to get home and feed. I've got work to do. I've got housework to do. So this idea of like this Western therapeutic model of like a mental health debrief, it just didn't work, right? It didn't work for everyone. So staying longer in the office to debrief wasn't an act of care. It was actually a stressor. So it's just making me think about the models, the dominant models that we use, and who do they actually work for, and who's kind of maybe Parth is much better at articulating this than me, but which therapeutic models are they based on, and how does power come into play with all of that? So thanks for raising that example, Vandita.
Thank you, Leila. I think Parth wants to come in with a point here as well.
Yep, I think thanks a ton for bringing out that coloniality of care, and I think that's very important here. Just to give context to ASHA workers, ASHA, the meaning of the ASHA word is hope, and it's very ironical in India because there's a lot of research done, even with organizations that I work with, where ASHA workers don't have hope themselves because of how overburdened they are with care, right? And as much as we want to replicate models of task sharing and peer-based counseling from the West that have worked there, the onus of care often falls on community workers who themselves have multiple roles, and they're often not remunerated. And at the same time, I think even within the CSO sector, even just within the healthcare sector as well, right, the way that we view care is very individualistic. So one of the examples that I have here is again a story where when I was working throughout the pandemic and I was training and I was working in a rehab center, you would get a lot of people who were forcibly displaced from Kashmir to within the India setup and would come to the rehabilitation center because they had nowhere else to go. So the cheapest thing could be during the pandemic for safety was to get institutionalized. And then when we were working with them there, the model for care was, okay, you come to therapy, you were spoken to for 1 hour, you take a few pills. If you're agitated, you're given an injection without your consent, and then you were reprimanded and institutionalized. Now, I was 21 when I started doing that, and I started working within that sector and started looking at what it means to be within those spaces and realize very early on that it's just simply not possible culturally to be able to provide that level of care. And to say that, okay, care means one-to-one meetings, in a cabin for someone who's been forcibly displaced out of their home and is now being institutionalized because of the lack of funding. So now also within a lot of the work that we do, right, it becomes very important to look at what does care mean? And again, going back to Vandita's point as well, do people have agency over the care that they're defining? Or are we, in the idea of inclusivity, putting models of Western psychotherapy on them and saying, you come and do a debriefing call, you come and do a safeguarding call with me, we do a one-on-one checkup session and a follow-up session, not realizing that they're crossing cultural boundaries here. Or these just might be re-traumatizing the people further, that their care might not be speaking about it again. And as someone who's trained as a trauma therapist, it gets very important for me to mention that again and again to people that you don't have to speak about it again. Even though we within the sector, that re-traumatization process is not required. And that your care can simply be community oriented outside of work if you wanted to. So that agency has to be of the person. And that still is something that we're not able to grapple around. And how do we make that happen on such a large scale? Specifically in the context of India, where not every organization is in a metropolitan, has a workforce of 100, 200, 300 people, is internationally funded, right? We have grassroots organizations that are working on small funds and on community mutual aid as well. So where does agency lie is a very important question here.
Thank you for that, Parth. I think it's been such a great conversation that I have lost track of time. So I know we have a little bit of time left. There are some specific questions for each of you. I'm going to prioritize some of the ones that have come from the team and the community, and maybe let go of some of my own. So I think perhaps the first question I can direct to Omaid. Omaid, there's a question, especially from the team, is it's really brave that you've chosen to share your story as a way to destigmatize mental health in your community. Have you ever feared or have you ever faced a sort of weaponization of your story or a backlash to what you're sharing about your mental health, to have that used against you? Because to give you context, in the South Asian context, often when you share, say, for example, I have anxiety at work, it can go really south, right? It can lead to your manager using that against you when you don't perform. It can be used in a performance review. It can be used to fire you. And this is true for CSOs quite severely, because CSOs become the space where employees end up sharing this quite often. Also, when you share it publicly, it becomes tough to get hired after that. So yeah, this was one question, if you want to take it.
Sure. Yeah, well, most of the time it is used to sort of show that you're a weak person. And, in our context, especially in South Asia, you have to project strength all the time. And especially if you're founding or running an organization, leading an organization in places which there's a lot of toxic masculinity and all of that. So you have to be strong all the time. And when you're speaking about mental health and we're speaking about these challenges, I think there has been two kinds of feedback. One, I have been praised for it because there's a lot of people who have come to me personally saying that, you know what, I'm going through the same, I feel the same panic attacks, I have the same anxieties, I feel depression. They've opened up, they've started speaking about, they're taking antidepressants, they're taking medication, so I think in one ways it has shown I have built meaningful conversations with people, meaningful relationships, and our conversations and friendships have gone another level. And I think we have built that trust. So that is a good part of it, which was surprising to me as well. But the other side of it is also when like the governments or the bigger players, they want to discredit you and stuff like that, to discredit the whole organization through associating these kind of issues to you. It has happened to us, but I think we as leaders of these organizations, we tend to be more resilient, more hardworking. And when you perform and when you achieve and you show that despite everything that's coming your way, if it's mental health or physical health or issues of allegations or whatever, or people using your mental health issues as a weakness point, you show and you perform and you continue your work with empathy, with good intentions, with a lot of kindness. I think that really shows up. It just goes one step above everything. And I think my experience has been, it has helped me. I've sometimes my partner Lima jokes with me that I've spoken about the time I was evacuated from Kabul airport more than 100 times or maybe 150 times to maybe the same people. And I don't know it, but every time I sit with my friends and then I start speaking about it because it's so traumatic. And I think by speaking about it every time, over 100 times, it has helped me process everything slowly and gradually. And at the same time, with those people, I've built more cohesion, more meaningful friendships, and all of that.
That's really beautiful. And thank you for sharing that. I think just the ability to make connections and feel like you're not alone is such a powerful thing. And it's also such a powerful trade-off, because I really appreciated you sharing that sometimes there is pushback, right? There will be negative consequences, but the positives far outweigh the negatives. Thank you for that. Leila, there's a question for you, especially since you shared about your experience working with different organizations and what it was like when you started off younger versus now. What can a young worker, perhaps who's not a founder, really even do to change things?
This is really hard. It's such a hard question, because I go back to this point around responsibility, and the key question is, what is it your responsibility to hold as a junior employee with relatively very little power in an organization? And what is really the responsibility of the organization? So who's holding what responsibility? And really, you know, a good civil society organization will kind of create an enabling environment for you as a young worker to be able to practice your own self-care. You know, it will create an enabling environment in which collective care is taking root. People are kind of looking out for each other. I would say, look, don't be too hard on yourself. If you find yourself in an environment or a civil society organization in which that just simply isn't possible, it's not your responsibility as one junior employee to transform the whole NGO. And I do meet people like that. You know, we do regular trainings around feminist leadership with emerging leaders. And we will meet people who will say, oh, you know, my organization feels really toxic. What can I do? And the reality is, actually, if you're spending more time trying to change the organization than you are being able to kind of, I don't know, do the work that you care about, or kind of preserve your own sanity, you know, your own well-being, then it's just not worth it. And I say that with the full acknowledgement that not everyone has the privilege of being able to leave a job like that. So my advice would be, look, just pure self-compassion. If you're in that kind of situation, find your community, find your allies. I mean, organizational cultures, even the ones that are like infused with this notion of, you know, productivity at all costs, or organizations driven by very capitalist logics, those cultures are rarely monolithic, right? There will be small sites of resistance and contestation within them. There will be other people feeling the way you feel. And I would say what you need to do is seek out those people, and seek out those people as sources of mutual support, people who can kind of support you as you're navigating this and trying to go through it. And I don't know, there's no easy answers really, but I would always say, look, it's not all of this is yours to hold. It's really not.
Thank you. That's really powerful advice. And I feel like sometimes a lot of these thoughts also come from a deep-rooted place of guilt, right? You're not able to talk about it publicly because there's already so much anti-rights and anti-gender movement work happening that you don't want to let down your sector or your organization. And I've seen so many young people fully burnt out because you individually cannot change something that large. And that's a good thing, right? Because if you could do that, then that means you could become the person who's in an oppressive position. And the fact that you need people to create change is so powerful. So thank you for that. I will also just quickly say, I think in a lot of countries, we tried to find someone from a union, a civil society organization union that could be on this panel as well. And we just couldn't. There are a few across the world, of course, and we did reach out, but it just made me also think about the need for collective bargaining and organizing around labor rights. So just something you shared, find the people that align with you and start collectivizing internally, and that can be a great source of resistance as well. Thanks, Leila. And Parth, my final question, which is for you, especially given your work and your background, and given the cultural context of well-being in different societies, different ecosystems, what sort of misconceptions around mental health or just general well-being, and I don't want to restrict it, the question is more about mental health, but I do want to expand that beyond mental health, to think about well-being in civil society that you have encountered, right? And I'll make a quick addendum to say the reason I'm expanding beyond mental health is there's been an interesting trend with the younger population, with the younger group of people, I would include myself, right? Like up to say 30, 35, where some of us are now more able to talk about mental health at work, but not about physical health and not about like physical disability, which is a very interesting dynamic for us. Because I remember, and I'll give OFC's example because I don't want to share what was shared in the question. I remember once we have a values and conflict session where we had a chat around accessibility, accommodation versus just what we need to get done. And everyone spoke about mental health. But when it came to physical health and certain staff members sharing physical health needs, people's empathy dropped like by 10 points. And it was just really difficult to witness and see because we do have staff members with physical disabilities, and it's just not romanticized enough on social media, right? Being in a wheelchair is not romanticized on social media, but depression is, which is not to say either or is good. But how do you navigate this like intergenerational cultural context to health and well-being in the civil society space? I'm sorry for that really long question.
No, that is all right. I was just absorbing all of that because there's so much going on in my head around this. I think I would start by saying I think the primary misconception around health in general is that an individual has autonomy over how their health behaves. And I think we've been processed and we've been also conditioned that you can take care of yourself if you just do these things, maintain boundaries at work, have a work-life balance, have a healthy diet, make sure that you're aware of systems. And also, as much as we preach towards the individual, one of the common misconceptions is that if a person is devoid of the utilities and of basic material things that are required for them to sustain their livelihood and that of their families, we cannot view health in a silo. And their health cannot function in that silo as well, right? So we can't view that in that lens. And I think from what you're also talking about in just the general way of understanding mental health versus physical health, that happens quite a bit with me as well. When I'm sharing my own experience with mental health, I get higher resonance than when I talk to people about me being visually impaired, because me being visually impaired is still looked at as a lack, whereas me having mental health conditions is looked at as more systemic. So people are still okay with understanding mental health as a systemic concept because somewhere at the end of the day, everyone has some of the other experience. It might not be as severe as a psychosocial disability, but it is an experience of systemic violence. At the end of the day, if you're not a white person who's older, who's heterosexual, who's cisgendered, and a male, then you have experience of some or the other forms of systemic harm. That is just the norm of how the cis heteropatriarchal society works. So there's some solidarity between that space. What I see is that cross-movement solidarity completely goes away when physical disabilities come into place, because it's harder to visually see someone struggle and to know that you are helpless as well, because you cannot change the disabling environment that we're all in. And I'll give an example of how when I used to work in a full-time capacity in person, there was a staircase that had multiple plants on it, right? Now, I don't have peripheral vision because of my disability in both eyes, so I can't see on the sides. Now, when I would walk on narrow staircase, I simply cannot move. So I would need assistance. I would need assisted movement. I cannot carry a bag. If there were flower pots, I would trip, and I have tripped multiple times. So then it would become, oh, that's so sad that you tripped. But we can't change the staircase because we don't have funds to change the office. So what can we do? We can remove the flower pots from the staircase. But if I tell people I am going through a depressive episode, I've not been on my pills, can literally not have the energy to walk up. Okay, can you sit on the ground floor? Because that's something that we can see. That's something we can do something for, or that's something we can negotiate with. So there is that understanding that with mental health, you can still negotiate with providing reasonable accommodations, but for physical health, there simply aren't funding enough or opportunities enough or sensitization enough for people to provide that avenue to begin with at the workspace. And also one of the very common misconceptions that I see is that I think we've agreed that we are mitigating those risks that the state has left open, or the disenfranchisement that the state is causing, and the role that they have. So it becomes the role of the civil society organization or the not-for-profit sector to take that role on. But at the end of the day, that onus is still off the state. And if our work is not constantly still putting that onus back on the state, somewhere we're also perpetuating that same cycle of harm. that it's okay for us to constantly keep working on these issues, constantly keep working with these disenfranchised communities without ever putting that onus on the state. So then we start internalizing the idea of care to also be individual, because, well, this comes from that idea of benevolence, right? That we are working for the communities. So there's some sort of nobility to the work that we're doing. So it's okay if some of us are working overtime, some of us do not have reasonable accommodation, because it's all for a good cause. So I think in that lens, just the idea of, again, individual care, I would say, is a very common misconception with mental health. And it all revolves around what even Leila said before that, right? That it revolves in community spaces and mutual aid. And the more we recognize that environments are literally physically disabling and we need to change that and we need to provide reasonable accommodations, the more those conversations would happen. And I agree with you, there is a romanticization of mental health right now because it's on the zeitgeist. And I think the pandemic provided a very good leeway for that to happen because our attention economy was focused on the mental health impact of the pandemic. So now there's also capitalization. The more you see quick therapy get schemes, you see packages of therapy that you can take, you can see wellness packages being sold online, self-care models. It's because the zeitgeist and the capitalist industries co-opted the movement. So you would have advertisements which are focused towards mental health, but you will not have advertisements that are focused towards disability because it is not a commercial aspect anymore since the pandemic, since that isolation was created, at least within some parts of India as well. So I think that awareness is very important to see where and what is trending and how are we incorporating that within our own systems of care as well, and whether or not we're recognizing that environments are disabling to begin with. I hope that answered your question. I think I also went on quite a bit of tangents there. Yeah.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I tried to paraphrase a really long question into what I did, but I think you answered it spot on. Thank you very much for that. And I think in conclusion, it also adds a different flavor to what we've been thinking about well-being, right? I do think even invariably our conversation has ended up focusing more on mental health and well-being. And I think about that for myself as well. I am someone that lives with chronic conditions. And something I realized over the last 2 months, just for context for anyone listening in, I went through a really terrible health period, but a terrible physical health period. And I'm going to be really candid to say that it was much more awkward for me to share this is what's happening to me physically than it has ever been to share this is what's happening with me mentally. But this is with the caveat of who I'm sharing it with. Like when I talk to my parents, it's much easier to say this physical health thing is happening. But when I talk to my colleagues, when I talk to people my age especially, it's much easier to say I was feeling anxious than I'm being operated on for this thing, or I can't walk for 3 days for X or Y, right? And it's been an interesting dynamic. So thank you for bringing that in. We have like 5 minutes. So I have one last question for everybody, and maybe I'll give everyone 1 minute each only. It's basically like, how do you think we could make worker well-being a sustained priority, but not just a priority, also a reality, right? Who are the stakeholders? What are their responsibilities? How can we do this? Maybe a minute each to get to that. Yeah. Leila, do you want to go first?
How do we make it a sustained priority? Look, I mean, maybe I work on feminist leadership. Maybe I can talk about, we haven't really spoken about the role of leaders in all of this. And maybe this isn't the whole picture by any stretch, but I think nothing's really going to take root in organizations unless leaders are on board, they're role modeling these practices, they're prioritizing these practices. And I think, look, sadly, I look around me at many parts of the civil society sector, and I still see leaders who are fixated with growth at all costs, are buying into these kind of capitalist logics whereby workers are mere cogs in a wheel, and whose conceptions of wellness are not very political. So they're kind of putting a band-aid over what is essentially a gaping wound. You know, these yoga lunches or meeting-free Fridays as solutions to what are really systemic issues. And we also need leaders brave enough to go up against donors who are pushing these dynamics further down the funding ecosystem to those who are least able to bear it. We need kind of leaders to come together collectively and kind of say enough, no more, and make the case for why this is, you know, a social justice issue. It's a feminist issue. It's a human rights issue. It's a social justice issue. That's one part of the picture that I'd like to see.
Thank you very much for that. Parth, do you want to go next?
Yep, I think I borrow from the whole idea of the revolution will not be funded, and taking from the fact that, we're looking at sustaining communities from within and not requiring those external sources of funding to begin with. So to make priorities of wellness and just, the idea of health in general to come up and be politicized, it would be very important to know that communities need to have agency in that aspect. So they need to be in the conversation with leaders who are making those decisions for us. So we need people to look at community leaders to center their voices. A lot of the times when we're looking at international movements, national movements of human rights, there are people working in non-for-profit sectors, there are people working in civil society sectors who are not in touch with the communities that they're working with. So we need to center the voices of the communities and bring those perspectives forward and say, okay, you get to have agency over what you are going through, and you get to decide, what is the best action for your community as well. And at the same time, I think it's also, I call myself an abolitionist in the making because I'm very young in this field, like a sapling. But I think it's also because if the systems were not created for our care, they cannot fail us to begin with. So if you're looking at retrospectively pushing a brick into an already existing wall and saying, okay, this is healthcare, now take it, I'm also giving you money to fund it, it's simply not going to work. So it becomes extremely important to start creating new spaces. And it's a radical thought to think about abolishing existing frameworks of healthcare and say, okay, we know that these systems don't work. Let's at least start conceptualizing areas that might work. Let's start conceptualizing areas of community where we do not require external funding. And that radical thought can drive actionable steps that can take place within community settings as well, right? But I think at the end of the day, sustainability falls under financial security for the community within the community and the empowerment within the community itself.
Thank you very much for that, Parth. Omaid?
Yes, very specific 5 things that we do at ArtLords. First, well-being, staff well-being is a core value of the organization. I think it's across the organization. Everybody should understand it or aware about it. And I think it is very important to have that as a core value. Second, the leadership of the organization, including me and co-founders, executives, they should show genuine intentions that they want to address mental health. They speak about it and find solutions for it, be it in any way, if it's workshops, speaking about it, resources, online, all of that. Third, we need to have a specific budget in our organizations for mental health well-being. Not a lot of money, but just a little bit that it can really support small safe spaces, workshops, or whatever people need for their mental health. Fourth, communicate. Talk to the stakeholders, talk to the donors, talk to the government, talk to everybody. Communicate about what is happening, about the staff's well-being, mental health, traumas, and all of that. I think it's very important to shout out to everybody, especially in the civil society, that what's happening. And last, what we do is we share information. We share information with organizations like yourself. I get more resources, information about organizations like yourself. Whenever I go to a platform, a conference, one of the first questions I have from the organizations, what are we doing for the mental health of your organization? If they have any lesson learned, any database, and anything, I get it, bring it back to my organization.
Thank you very much, Omaid. I think I'm taking away a lot from here. Like a lot of really, what I love is I'm also taking away practical suggestions, right? Like I'm also saying, okay, this is what I could do today at OFC. And I can't do this today because I can't afford it, but I can plan to do it in 3 or 5 years or figure out a way to do it. So I really appreciate it. I love that our conversation got political. We really spoke about resource crunches, socio-political context, bureaucratic context we work in, which create hindrances, but also like the positives that there are funders willing to do this. There are community models that could work. There are organizations doing some of this. There are small things that could work, right? So I think that's been a great takeaway for me. I'm also left with a lot of like bigger questions, I think, for another panel sometime, which is like, what does worker well-being look like once you retire? What does it mean for like queer and trans folks whose family models look different? What does it mean to be disabled and to work in this sector? Like a lot of like other questions which are also around worker well-being, which of course might need lots of hours of conversation, but really, really grateful for each of you. You've been fantastic. And I've taken away so much. I know everyone listening in will. So thank you. I will close the panel now. But if you're listening in, you can also like just drop comments or add questions in the chat, and we will get back. We will respond to the questions and comments that come in, whichever social media platform you watch this on. And please connect with the 3 of them and the work that they do. It's fantastic. And I've personally learned so much from their work and their organizations and teams as well. Thank you.